device.
Yes.
Okay, so we're here at a meeting of the steering committee of the Vermont Climate Council. Welcome everybody, September 11th here. Thanks for joining. I dropped in the chat the agenda, and before we dive into it, any questions about the agenda or concerns that folks want to raise before we dive into the items here? All good?
Looks good.
Okay. There's some minutes to approve that are hyperlinked in there, so I'll give folks just a minute. That's what I should have been asking you to do. Sorry. Does anybody need a moment to look at those minutes before we move to approve them? Okay. Any concerns about those minutes the way they are? Okay. All good? All right. We'll treat those as approved. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to do is look at this latest draft of the governance document. It got sent around late last week. Apologies. And I can just give you a quick heads up of what happened in it since we last spoke. And I think the only thing that happened in that document since we spoke was I changed the name of it from process document to governance document, because that we kept calling it the governance document. And then there was a suggestion about how to fix that second sentence under the subheading of role of the council. To just make it clearer, I think it was from Bram. And I updated that sentence to that new suggestion. It's the second sentence on the second page under the subheading of role of the council. That is the only thing that happened in there that you all haven't seen. That said, let's do a quick pause, and if there's anything else that you'd like to do before you send it on at the full council, now's the moment. Anything else that folks are feeling urgently like we need to update it before we send it on to the full council? That is the most happy silence I've heard in a long time. Yeah, go ahead, Jerry.
No, I think that there are probably lines that any of us, might personally write a little bit differently, but I think that this content reflects the kind of good process and the kind of consensus that we've arrived at over the last couple of meetings, and I think is ready to share with the full council for their review and consideration.
Great.
From my opinion. Thanks,
Jared. Yeah, I bet everyone could see a few little turns of phrases that they'd improve. I wonder, at one point we talked about sharing a track change version and a clean version. I don't think there is a possibility of sharing a track change version at this point. It has moved so far beyond that first big track change we did a while ago that my suggestion, and I just asked this, is to send a clean version, because the track change in this version is just building off a previous track change. Any concerns about just sending a clean version to the council? Kelly?
I wonder if it would make sense or be helpful to them if we sent them the original, the one we approved before, and sent them the clean version, and then if they want to compare and contrast, they can. But I agree, I don't think that at this point anyone would find it useful to try to go through all the many changes and tease it out.
Yeah. Jared?
Yeah, it seemed like there was an initial draft that had a whole bunch of track changes, and then we accepted those, and then we did additional track changes from a clean version. So there's really, to follow it, I think there would have to be, folks would have to look at two different track changed versions. And I agree that at this point, it would be too much to try to go back and add that second round of track changes into the original one. And I don't even know how readable it would be at that point. I do think that for just sake of transparency, both of the process and of the content that was changed, it would probably be helpful to include both of those track change versions. Like, this was the first one, this was the second one, but encourage people to first review the clean version. But just so if anybody does want to follow the process or see what was changed, I would be much more comfortable with that, even though I agree that practically folks will probably want to primarily review the clean version or the second track changed version.
Yeah. You know, this makes me think that I wonder if a good strategy would be, first of all, writing like a paragraph intro in the email that says, these are the key things that the steering committee worked on, and just sort of name some of these areas of the document that you worked on. And then every time we've had a meeting, we link the document into our meeting. So we could just put the links. If you want to track how this thing has evolved over the last couple of meetings of the steering committee, here's this link, this thing, this thing. And you could, if somebody was feeling very eager, you could go in and look through. How's that sound? Okay. Great. So we'll write up a paragraph to go with this that just names the areas of the document that where you spent the most time. Okay, great. Anything else on this before we move to the next item? All right. Super. Wonderful. Well, it's great to have that in a place where you feel comfortable sending it off to the full council. And thanks everybody for really getting into the details of that. And it's a much better document thanks to that. All right. Next, the agenda for our next council meeting. I'm going to put this on the screen and share it while we're talking. Let me just walk through what's been shared. You've seen this if you read the materials this weekend or late last week. And I'll just walk through the logic of this, and then let's talk about it. There's a gap at the front. We still actually need some thoughts about how to continue with the tradition of always starting with a just transition reflection. We don't have a good thing for that, so let's circle back and see if you all have some thoughts on that. The guts of the meeting, in addition to that, will be reviewing of the governance document, and with an opportunity of, if there's revisions that want to be offered in real time at a fairly high bar, that you all can make decisions on potential revisions in real time if you want to do that. Then biomass. And here there is a document that biomass council or writing group has come up with. And we're just circulating that amongst them right now and making sure there aren't any last little nips and tucks. And we'll be able by tomorrow to send that off to the council. We're positioning this not as a decision-making moment on that document, but as an opportunity to really look at it, talk about it, get feedback, and be prepared to come and make a decision at the subsequent council meeting. And we can talk about when that subsequent council meeting will be. So this is fairly intense to do this plus public comment plus break. So that's the flow of the first 2/3 of the meeting. And allow, after the public comment, the break, any concluding thoughts about biomass. We anticipate a fairly robust public comment around that, as you all can imagine as well. And then we tucked at the end of this, this initial conversation about work planning. And one of the reasons why is it has implications for the fall, in addition to implications for the next 12, 24 months. But we thought it'd be important to start this now and maybe make some decisions about the sort of very short-term issues about priorities for the fall or things that need to happen. And make sure everyone was aware of the letter from the state legislature. So that's the flow that we had imagined of it, and it's pretty busy. And let me just stop sharing my screen and say, sort of big picture wise, before we get into any like real nitty gritty, but big picture wise, are we doing what we should do in this meeting? Are these the right conversations to have? And Jane or Julie, go right ahead.
So I have a couple of suggestions. One, in terms of the Just Reflections transition, the Public Service Department and ANR have been working with Efficiency Vermont over the last month or so to look at ways to deploy some of the ARPA dollars to help both support low and moderate income households in replacing their flood ravaged heating systems and doing it with electric systems to the extent that makes sense, but also modern wood heat or high efficiency fossil fuel systems. And think it would be great for the council to hear about some of that work. And Jane or I could probably reach out to Peter Walk or Bryn Oakley from his staff and see if one of them would be available to share the work they're leading there.
Okay, nice.
And then the other thing I wanted to flag is just have spent some time over the weekend thinking about the speaker's letter. I honestly think many of the things she's requesting are addressed in the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is currently out on draft for public comment, and think it would make a lot of sense to have Stephanie Smith from Vermont Emergency Management into a council meeting. I don't know that it can work for September given the nature of that agenda, but have Stephanie Smith into a council meeting to walk us through the draft plan. The only advantage I see to having her in September is I think it would still be during the public comment period. And so if the council wanted to engage in that, it needs to be sooner to be timely. That said, I think at least 3/4 of what the speaker asked for is taken up in that plan, and would hate to see us reinvent the wheel.
And I think that I want to carry that specific conversation forward, Julie, when we look at the work planning and how the council is suggesting it should respond and be responsive to that letter. And let's take that comment and look at that specifically when we go in a little more detail in there.
Sure.
Okay, so a suggestion for the Just Transitions reflection, and then a question mark about the right moment to have Stephanie Smith come in and talk about the state plan. Kelly.
So I also had a suggestion for the Just Transitions reflection, but I think Secretary Moore's suggestion sounds really timely because of the flooding, and this is, I think, going to be important for people to hear. But in general, I would love if we tried to reach out to members of frontline and impacted communities who might be able to share their experience or experiences of others in their community in a meaningful way to help, let us glimpse into the worlds of the folks that we're working towards justice for. So I think that would be a really nice thing to have as a practice, but I think given the timeliness of this with all the flooding, Secretary Moore's suggestion for this meeting is a really good one.
Thanks, Kelly. That's helpful. Jared?
Yeah, I agree with this suggestion about the Just Transitions reflection for this month, and also with Kelly's kind of going forward as a priority consideration. One other thing that that I think aligns well with actually both what Secretary Moore and with what Kelly were pointing to is that I think, again, not for September, but for a future meeting, I think it could be really valuable to hear from some of the folks with Green Saving Smart and the financial and energy counseling that they're doing through the community action agencies, primarily supporting Vermonters, households with lower incomes, in terms of what's working, what's challenging. I think that could be a really valuable reflection at a future date if we're trying to kind of build a list of potential additional Just Transitions reflections going forward. The other reflection I have on this agenda is I agree with Secretary Moore's suggestion that would be really helpful to hear from Stephanie as context in as we consider responding to the speaker's request. I'm a little bit I think that the content all looks right. I do wonder about the flow. It does feel to me that kind of a natural extension of the governance document is the work planning. And I worry about having the work planning last and kind of, you know, crammed into a really short 25-minute section, especially if we're wanting to have kind of the state hazard mitigation plan and Stephanie's voice as part of that framing and context. I don't know whether it would make sense to kind of flip in the order of the agenda, the work planning and then have biomass go last. We may also, I don't know, timing wise, if it's too late, but you know, I think it would be worth, you know, adding even another half hour to the agenda just to feel like we can do everything, give everything the time it likely needs to be done well. David, you're muted.
Sorry, a bus was going by. Bram, and then I saw a hand go up, I think specifically about Jared's suggestion about flipping. Bram, go ahead.
So relative to just transition, my thought was consistent and slightly broader than what Secretary Moore suggested. And I think that what Secretary Moore suggested is really important, but I also think it would be valuable to sort of have a status summary of where we are in terms of what is available today to low-income and other marginalized communities in terms of electric heat, electric transportation, weatherization, and if any of those things are not yet immediately available, sort of a projected timeline for when they will be.
Okay. All right. Jane and Julie?
I was just going to react to Jared's suggestion. I appreciate kind of the flow, given all of the challenges we've had with scheduling the biomass conversation and the fact that there are a number of folks who are active participants with the council from a public perspective. I think pushing it off to the end and having it potentially get shortchanged if our work planning conversation goes long is kind of an untenable position to find ourselves in, I would say, again, knowing that that's happened a couple of times in the past, and just want to be really sensitive to that. I think the potential of extending the meeting slightly makes sense, but I wouldn't support moving the biomass conversation down on the agenda just because I want to make sure we give it its full due.
Okay, great. I'm going to let some of these threads just hang out there for a little bit, and then we'll try to pull them together. Kelly, go ahead.
Directly in that conversation, what if we move biomass up in the agenda so that the two pieces that fit together are together, but we give biomass the priority spot? And I mean, that could take a lot of extra time. So maybe we do want to make the meeting a little longer, so we can give space for full engagement with public comment and other people time to really weigh in. But yeah, that was a thought.
Great. Right now it's a 3-hour meeting, right? So we would make it a 3.5 hour. We'd have a break in the middle. Okay. And I think it's tough on people's agendas to change something at the not last minute. We're still a couple weeks out, but I'm not sure how people feel. Like, do we make it a question or do we make it a we just do it? So I sort of leave that to you all. Do you want to make this a question to your fellow counselors, or do you want to say, actually, we've decided we need to add a half hour and end at 2:30? What do y'all think?
I threw in one other tidbit of information. That day is Yom Kippur. So that means that any of our Jewish community members who want to observe Yom Kippur might not really be willing to be in a meeting at all, no matter how long it is. So I just I noticed that a couple days ago.
Thanks for pointing that out. That's good to know. Okay. All right, so if I were to pull a couple of these threads together, it sounds like there's an interest in having the governance conversation go together with the work planning conversation, and while making sure we absolutely prioritize biomass. So we could put biomass first, right after the just transitions reflection, let that run, take some public comment, react to the public comment, take a break, and come back and do governance and work planning. Something like that. Does that sound good? And then in terms of adding a half hour, I think you're all feeling the instinct of like, wow, I think we're going to run a little late, right? So if that feels like the right thing to do, we could just do it and signal to folks we've added this half hour. And or we could send out a quick, could anybody not do the half hour, to see if we continue to have a robust group of us. I'll let you all make that choice if you feel strongly one way or the other.
David, so my vote would be to just extend the meeting, because I think what otherwise happens is the meeting ends, discussion is still going on, but people who have a hard stop kind of jump off, and then we lose quorum and we lose context. And so I would prefer to not give anyone,
Yeah.
I would prefer to allow people to plan for it.
Yes. Okay.
Just extend it by 30 minutes.
Perfect. Okay.
Just want to throw in a suggestion, add 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after the already scheduled agenda. That would be an easier make for most people.
How do folks feel about that? I see Liz being like, no. Wait, you're on mute, Liz.
I'm already scheduled before, but I hear David's point. So if that's how it goes, I'll just be 15 minutes late.
Okay. Just as a quick from steering committee members, do you want to just leave that in mine and Jane's hands to sort that out? Maybe with your chair, Secretary Clauser? Is that okay? All right. Thanks for the suggestion, David. Secretary Clauser, why don't you and I and Jane do a quick huddle on that, and we'll make a decision. Okay, great. Okay. So that sounds like it's coming together. Let me just pull that back up. And what we were going to do. The section around work planning, we're going to talk about that specifically in just a moment. And so we can hold the conversation about how to involve Stephanie until we get to that, because we may decide there's a really great place to slot her in that's not this meeting. So if everyone is comfortable holding that conversation about how to handle that their work planning conversation, let's hold that for a sec. Is there anything else on the agenda that folks want to shout out? I do want to note one of the ways we're trying to do the public comment these days is having public comment on the thing that right after the thing we think is probably going to generate the most comment, and then leaving another block of time to have a conversation about that if anyone, the counselors, want to react to what they heard. And so sort of concluding the conversation in this case on biomass will happen after a public comment. And again, our conclusion for the biomass conversation is a shared set of notes of feedback, so that if there's a need to adjust the document, we have some clarity about the views expressed in the meeting. And that'll be our ending point for the biomass conversation, is a shared set of feedback and notes that the counselors would like to see in any kind of revision to the document when they're finally approve it in a subsequent meeting. Does that make sense? Okay. In contrast, we're looking to approve the governance document and not come back and try to do that later. We want to just actually approve it. And if we need to do any kind of real-time adjustment, we'll do that as an amendment in real time. All right. Great. So before we jump into the work planning conversation, which will impact the way we structure the work planning section of the agenda September 25th, I wanted to make sure we don't forget that there's a specific request from Jared for some facilitation assistance in science and data. Jared, can you say a little bit more what happened in that meeting and why that request came up?
Yeah, absolutely. If it's okay, I just want to go back 1 second though, because I
Yeah.
just have a question, because recently, at least, from us saying okay to move forward governance document that we've
Yeah.
just moved forward, I just want to think about some language in that as it relates to what was just said about the process for the governance document. I think what you laid out sounds good, David, but I do think that there's a little bit of a discrepancy between that process and what we say here, because it says for significant decisions around policy or related matters in our governance document, how we govern ourselves, it says the council will strive to hold at least 2 sessions on the topic. First, an initial review of the content from a subcommittee or other source. This initial review is an opportunity for councilors to better understand the content and provide feedback to the authors. And then a second decision-making session. And so there may be rationale for kind of condensing the consideration of the governance document into 1 meeting, because this is a set of revisions. It's not being seen for the first time. A lot of the feedback was provided in a previous council meeting, and we were just trying to incorporate it. But I would just want us to be able to provide that rationale, because on first look, it could be seen to be not consistent with what we will have just what we're asking to be approved. It may be a gray area.
Well, and it's highlighted because of the difference of how we're handling biomass versus governance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have 2 quick reactions to that, Jared, and then I welcome others. One is, it was somewhat intentional to say for significant decisions around policy in related matters. It doesn't say process, right? That may have not been so clear to everyone, but one of the ideas there is for sort of more processy kind of things that we can be a little bit more efficient. But for the core sort of policy, whether it's biomass or your revisions to the climate action plan, that's what that sort of 2-step process is more guided towards. At least that was the way I understood it. And I take your point, Jared. It feels like we need to provide some rationale why we're doing it differently for this document versus that document. Do others want to weigh in here about this particular issue of sort of 2 bites of the apple versus 1? And I can share on the screen here. I have it right up. What Jared's pointing to is this right here. Hang on, it's probably pretty small. If folks can see that. All right. Kelly, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I did have that same thought go through my head when I was reading it, but reading the agenda, but I also felt like this wasn't a situation where it behooved us to make it a 2-step process, partly because it's a revision, partly because it's not exactly it's like gray areas, it's a policy or related matter or not. So I would say I think we should just give some rationale and say we feel like this is a revision. You guys have talked about this. We've already gotten some feedback, and that we also don't want this to go another 3 months or something until we actually adopt it. So given that it's not a super touchy topic, and this is the steering committee and this is our job, and we've deliberated a lot about it. So I feel comfortable just giving that rationale and keeping the agenda as is.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah.
I'm good with that. I just wanted to raise this, and I also think that the proof will be in the pudding in terms of what our fellow counselors say and how they end up deciding on this, and if it seems like a fairly straightforward consensus thing, which I think is is the hope, given the amount of work that's gone into this, then it will be a moot issue. But I just wanted to briefly pause on that question because it seemed relevant.
Yeah.
But if it's okay to go back to responding to your original prompt, David.
Yeah.
So the Science and Data Subcommittee met, I think a couple of weeks ago now, and on August 30th. And we started talking about doing work planning for our subcommittee, really working backwards from, this is very much paralleling the discussions we've had as a steering committee, working backwards from the plan revisions, the climate action plan revisions being due in July of 2025, and recognizing that while this is true for multiple subcommittees, it's especially true of the Science and Data Subcommittee. The number of pieces of contracted analysis that the Science and Data Subcommittee has been involved in reviewing RFPs, reviewing drafts, raising questions, providing feedback to a number of contracted consultants. And so we're starting to feel like it's especially important to be work planning even as soon as possible, and perhaps on a faster timeline than some of the other subcommittees are identifying for themselves. And so wanted to request some support, facilitation support for that work planning process for the subcommittee from CBI, recognizing that we had previously said that for such requests, facilitation requests beyond the council and the steering committee, they should be presented, that request should be presented to the steering committee. We just have a lot of members who want to be able to fully participate, and it's difficult for when we've got members of the subcommittee who are taking notes, co-chairing the meeting, just having some folks who can hold that space, move us through the process and capture notes would be really helpful to our process. So we wanted to bring that request forward.
Thanks, Jared. And having put this item on the agenda, I realize we had promised that next time we had this conversation, we'd come prepared with like, how many hours and what's the total budget, so people can feel comfortable, like what's the thing. And we completely swing and a miss on that. We don't have, unless Jane has it handy. But I can tell you what the sort of overall amount is, if folks are interested. Jared, this doesn't sound like a heavy lift. This sounds like a session or two of work planning, right?
Yep.
So yeah, so we're not talking about a significant amount of work here, but I just want to recognize that you all had asked for some more specificity about this on these requests. And Jane says she can put it in chat in a minute. Okay, sweet. Any questions or concerns about this request to use CBI facilitation hours? Kelly?
My only question, which I think was just answered, was that this would be for 1 or 2 meetings of the steering committee, not like the next 8 meetings.
Yeah, that's what was envisioned when we discussed it.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I agree with wanting, that's why Just Transitions, why we asked for it too, having someone who can hold that space so everyone can fully participate. I think that's really valuable.
Great. Okay. Any concerns with it? And Jane will throw the total amount in the thing, or Jane, we could even just make it a little note to folks later, and make a note to ourselves to really come ready for that. Okay. Any concerns just saying yes to that? Okay, great. Super. All right. So in our agenda, we had said we'd pause for public comment after this conversation. We're actually running early. So I just want to say, if there's anybody here who would like to comment about what's been said so far, let me just make a pause and allow that to happen. There's only, yeah. So let me just stop there. If anybody would like to comment on what we've been talking about so far, other comments that you'd want to make sure the steering committee hears. Okay. Great. And I can pause later as well, closer to the time that we said we'd do this. Okay. Great. Oh, nice. Thanks, Jane. She just threw in the chat. All right, so we're doing well inside that budget still. Okay, great. So next item is the work planning conversation. And here, as if you'll remember our last meeting, Jared raised his hand being willing to do some thinking with me, and we brought Jane into that. And we had a conversation. I took some notes, and then I went further than my notes. So Jared, I hope I didn't go like into a like completely unfamiliar space with this document. And what we were trying to do is what you all had asked us to do, I mean, you had talked about, which is mainly we need to work back from the July 2025 date and figure out how we want to sequence things in a way that allows us to do it the way we want to do it this time you want to do it. And so we started talking about that, and that brought us to also some trying to get our heads around any kind of short-term things that will be needed to make that work. And the notes that are linked in the agenda here are the result of that conversation and sort of one step further than the conversation, particularly in sort of this where it talks about the step 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of thing, where we didn't get to that much detail when Jared and Jane and I were speaking, but we did sort of allude to some of those things, and I then took it a little further forward. So maybe, Jared, let me turn it over to you for a second and say, you know, when you think about, work planning in the council, you look at this document we have in front of us. I'm happy to share my screen if you want me to. Particularly those top bullets. Can you say a little bit about sort of the conversation and what we were thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it was wanting to, we recognize that it could be done planning can be done different ways, working forwards or working backwards. But as we thought about the kind of what went well and what could be improved from the first CAP process and the desire to have more opportunity for more robust public engagement, more opportunity to have some key sets of data and analysis able to be reviewed and considered as the plan was being formulated. I think there was a real clear sense that we needed to be focused now on those timelines. What amount of time do they take, and do we want to give to them to make sure that they're not given so that they don't end up being more kind of compressed than would be ideal. So we also recognize that there are some shorter term things that we want to make sure get attention and resolved well, that many of which are in process, some of which are kind of newly identified, including the letter from Speaker Krawinski. But then we noted that there are also kind of outstanding things in terms of a final decision on the biomass revised language, that potential addendum, and on transportation. I have a comment on this language, but I can come back to that. And then in terms of the priority climate action plan, Jane can say more about this and say it better than I can, but it looks as though the final I think CCAP, what is that, comprehensive climate action plan that is due to the EPA for consideration of federal grants would be in just a couple of weeks beforehand of our climate action plan due date in July of 2025. And a first step in that process is, as I understand it, the priority climate action plan, or the PCAP. And so wanting the council to understand that process, to have eyes on what is in the PCAP submission, how it is pulling from and build from the initial climate action plan. And I think it will be important to see if there are any discrepancies or things that are not moved forward from the climate action plan in there. And if there are new opportunities that weren't necessarily considered the first time that we were crafting the cap. So I think that what we were identifying is this balance of wanting to focus on and see through some of these shorter term pieces of work that are really important, as we also have this larger overlay of working backwards from the revised cap deadline of July 2025, and thinking about especially the public engagement and the analytical pieces that are going to have much longer lead times that we need to begin mapping out and in the next months and in early 2024. So that's, hope that is helpful.
Yeah, that is. And then from that conversation, and we can get some of the details of this in a better place, right? Whether there's, you had mentioned, Jared, you have some thoughts on that transportation stuff, and the how you all respond to this request, I think may or may not be exactly what's in that paragraph. What happened down here is just sort of laying it out and saying this fall, science and data does need to start working with Jane and the Climate Action Office about identifying what are going to be those priority technical reports that'll most help the revision within the resources available to do that. And I think there's also groundwork happening around the public outreach that my team's helping through the Climate Action Office, so that when the council is ready to start talking to folks about things, there are more robust channels and ways to make that happen. So, and then it goes on from here, and I won't walk through this, but I think it's interesting for all of you to take a look at this. The way I'd imagined was, early next year is about sort of focusing the work and making sure there's clarity of where attention most is needed. And making sure that RFPs are getting out the door in time, so that when you get results, they're still at a time that you can influence decision making. And there's probably a round of public engagement focused around these kind of areas that you all are identifying, and how those are resonating or if something's missing. So I imagine in early next year, that is the essence of the work. And then for the second half of the year, or starting in June through the rest of the year, it's really the subcommittees taking the lead, doing their work, updating the council quite frequently on that work. And in that work, just transitions principles are woven intimately into it. It's not sort of a separate step. It's a constant part. And there's going to be outreach as needed, and the technical work's getting done. And in this, I'd be interested in people's reactions to this. I'm imagining that by the end of the year, all the subcommittee recommendations have come up, and it turns into, at the end of the year, into early next year, into the early 2025, a process of consolidating, pulling it all together in a comprehensive revision document, and giving yourselves as a council time to do reviews of it and to bring it out to public comment and that kind of stuff. So you're giving yourself more time than you had the last time around. And then on the basis of public comment, doing some revisions in the final months leading up to June, the end of June 2025. So that was kind of the flow. Jane and Julie.
Just a couple of things I want to make sure we're all on the same page about. If you could scroll back up to step 1, David. We need to acknowledge that there's some budget constraints on RFPs for technical reports, that we are in a current fiscal year. And I think we'll have some opportunity potentially with the climate pollution reduction grant we received from EPA, but it is far from unlimited, and that needs to be, I think, explicit. we say focusing the work, but I think we need to acknowledge that our budget is absolutely finite in this space.
Yeah. And
And then
I am, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that's gonna be super important up here, right? that those signals are very clear and explicit as science and data and the Climate Action Office are working together to say what's going to be most helpful to the revision process and is within the realm of the budget. So I feel like that has to be super clear here.
The other piece I think that needs to be identified here is there are two transitions, right, that are likely to take place just in terms of council membership during this time, with those Senate appointees up in the fall of 23 and potentially the administration's appointees up in the fall of 24, depending on the election. And I think we need to be very cognizant of that. There's assumed to be a continuity of work here that may or may not be possible depending on what the Senate does 3 months from now or 2 months from now, and then the election in fall of 24.
Okay. That's really interesting. Jared?
Yeah, the other thing that I think we need to add to this to also have eyes on and build in time for council deliberation about is, I think primarily we often think about the climate action plan as the venue for identifying the recommendations that can meet the legal obligations outlined in the Global Warming Solutions Act. But from the analysis we're seeing, we are not on track. There are areas of opportunity, but in terms of the overall emissions reduction requirements, we are not on track. And we know that either for 2025 or 2030, and we know that Advanced Clean Cars 2, while important, is not going to be enough on its own. And so an important moment in this timeline that we need to add in is the July 1st, 2024 statutory deadline that is the requirement for ANR to implement revised rules to ensure that we can meet the requirements and come into compliance with that.
Okay. Interesting. Secretary Moore, is that your hand?
It was actually mine, but I was thinking I might put it in the chat. But since you called on me, just real quick, just for technical analysis support, the business as usual model, I just do want to flag, we have an updated one as of the spring of 2023. And so just want to note that we would only really need to update that if there was significant like IRA funding or policies passed between now and 2024 or 2025. But I wouldn't think it would be worthwhile to spend the money on the BAU or think about that in the short term, because we did just do that. So the timing of that might become challenging along with some other things.
Okay. So I'm interested, the idea for this super drafty document was to get something on the page for the council to start chewing on and then imagine some decision-making in the short term. Are there changes to this document you'd like to see before it gets sent over to the full council? Are there improvements that need to happen right now before it gets pushed out to your fellow councilors?
I can think of three things really quick. One would be Secretary Moore's suggestion that at the outset of the process, we're setting the context about the known available budget and the kind of constraints that we'd be working within in terms of contracted analysis. I would like to see that specific deadline for ANR's, the statutory deadline for ANR to implement revised rules by July 1st, 2024 to be on the timeline. And I I think that transportation addendum language isn't quite right. There was kind of a interim addendum added that kind of narrowed that kind of gave some updates on the process and narrowed the kind of window of what was being looked at as being possible to achieve emissions reductions at scale and pace in that sector, between cap and invest policies or performance standard policies on fuel importers. Those still stand and exist, but whether or not they're sufficient, I think, is a question that hasn't been fully settled by the council or the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee or other committees that are focused on this. So, I think that there's got to be some way to say that there's interim language that may be updated, rather than is what's there is likely sufficient. I don't know if Bram, as a member of that task group and who's worked on that in cross-sector, wants to say anything about that, but I do think that language should be adjusted.
I don't have immediately in mind which revision we're sort of referring to here, but it is true that as time goes on and the statutory deadlines come closer, the options are narrowing. Whether we need to reflect that here or not, I don't know.
How about,
I was just referring to, on this first page of the work planning document that I just put in the chat, under the second main bullet point, there's a second sub bullet point on addendums. And I was just trying to note that I think the way that the transportation addendum is described, I don't think really reflects where a lot of the folks who've been focused on that feel like it is. I think it may be sufficient. There may be an opportunity to add greater specificity to that, but I don't think it's likely sufficient to carry us through.
Right. So it definitely could be worded differently to say there's an existing addendum with language that may need updating or may be sufficient, right? That kind of thing. Okay, great. I saw some hands in the conference room, and then I'll go to Secretary Clauser.
Yeah, I just was going to offer, in looking at the language of the Global Warming Solutions Act, the 2024 deadline, not disputing its existence or the need for the agency to do some work, it doesn't implicate the Climate Council. And so I don't think it necessarily needs to be on the Climate Council's work plan. It is all pretty clearly ascribed to the Secretary of Natural Resources and our rulemaking process.
And that was the question I had as well, is what does that date do for the council? Like, what is it? How is it a piece of the council's work?
If it's okay, just the reason that I totally agree with what Secretary Moore said, I think the reason that it is important and relevant is for the council to be aware of any proposed either new rules or rule revisions, to incorporate that into the analysis so we understand the kind of size of the gap and the kind of nature in terms of the array of recommendations that either need to be updated or added to the new plan. So, or to the revised plan in July of 2025. So agreed that, that is not a council decision, what rules ANR or revisions ANR moves forward. But I think that we need to know what those proposals are, and have analysis about what they can deliver, so that we can incorporate that into our planning process and the revised cap.
Okay. Secretary Clauser, did that address the concern that caused you to raise your hand?
Julie's, I was going to make the same point that Julie made, having looked at the GWSA.
Got it. Okay.
I would
Ram, go ahead.
If we get to the point where it is, triggered that ANR needs to engage in rulemaking to address the transportation gap, that that is done in communication with the transportation working group, so that if there's any work that's been done on one side or the other, it doesn't need to be repeated, and that good work on either side doesn't get omitted.
Thanks, Bram. Secretary Clauser.
Sorry, I guess I did have something to say, David. And maybe it addresses both Bram and Jared's concerns. I mean, the built into the rulemaking process, right, is public engagement and public hearings. Though those are also built in and required of the Secretary of an A&R in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So I think a requirement exists already that A&R include stakeholders in this space in developing whether or not any changes are necessary, both in July 1st and of 2024 and 2026. So I'm just not sure we need to also build that in to the work plan of the council, given those kind of requirements exist in multiple places already, both in the rulemaking process as prescribed in the APA, but then also in the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Okay. I wonder if a pathway on this, because it is an important date for several of you here, is just mentioned that the way you describe it, Jared, of like incorporating into the analysis what happens on that date, right? And anything that needs to happen is a way of flagging it. And then Bram, I wonder with Kristen's answer, does that sort of feel satisfying? Is there something else you want to say there around the coordination of those two processes? That was a question for you, Bram, if you want to.
Yes, and I'm just
thinking,
contemplating for an instant here. So I think it would not be the most efficient pathway for A&R's rulemaking to incorporate the work of the Transportation Working Group by having members of the Transportation Working Group join in public hearings. It seems to me we could meet more directly and in smaller groups and get the path forward optimized and sorted out that way.
Okay. So how would you
David,
like? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I weigh in here? We have to be really careful that the rulemaking process does not get the Climate Council special status. This is a distinct and separate process and a whole set of procedures that the agency is required to uphold. And there are certainly ways to solicit input and ideas in advance. We do that oftentimes through pre-rulemaking work with affected stakeholders. But we, as an agency, cannot be seen as giving preferential status to one group of stakeholders over another and how we just go about the development of our rules. That's just a universal truth. That's not specific to anything having to do with climate or the Climate Council. And just want to make sure that we're not anticipating some sort of special status here.
Okay. So in this conversation, I'm listening for what would be any changes to this document before it goes to the council in the next day or two. I've heard a couple changes that are easy and quick to make, like make sure the context of available budget and constraints is input whenever we talk about the sort of technical reports. The suggested change to the way the transportation's talked about, where it may or may not need updating, sort of be a little bit less definitive on that. And then I've heard this piece around how you mentioned the rulemaking date and how that's relevant for the council work. And that's where I'm struggling to figure out how to make a a change to be reflective of what you all think.
Yeah.
What,
If I can, I think that I don't really see this any different than the kind of process and approach that was used in the previous rulemaking around advanced clean cars 2 and advanced clean trucks. I don't think that council is asking for special status. I think what is being asked for is an awareness of the process, updates as it goes, and any analysis that underlies it that affects our statutory obligation to the council as the body that was charged with alongside ANR and state government, but the body that was charged with meeting the legal obligations of the Solutions Act. So, you know, to me, this is really just about being aware of, having eyes on that is a key date. We'll need to know what is being proposed and be able to incorporate that in terms of the analysis of what it would mean to changes to business as usual or to the pathways projections as we're revising the climate action plan.
okay. If it's important to have that comment in this document, then it seems like the appropriate place to do that, if folks are comfortable with it, is when we're talking about the developing draft plan revisions. You could make a bullet or a part of one of these bullets of, you know, subcommittees are aware, blah, 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 of what's happened or what's going on from rulemaking. So it could just be mentioned as like, hey, this is going to be happening. And as a council, we need to pay attention to it. Would that be an appropriate place to do that and make that mention of like, there's an important date in the middle of this, which is July 1, and it can influence how the council is addressing these issues? Does that work for folks? Any concerns about that? Okay. All right. So with that, I wonder, are there other changes to this document as we go through it super quick that you'd absolutely want to make before it goes to the council? And I can watermark the heck out of this thing too with a big draft watermark and some other stuff, so it doesn't feel like you know, a highly elaborated document. Kelly?
There was just one thing that we discussed last meeting that it didn't seem like it was really reflected in here, and I think it's important, is how we're going to work on some of those cross-cutting issues that don't fit nicely in any of the subcommittees. Because I think, you know, in our governance document, we said we don't want to rely on task groups as much. Then we need to have an alternative for some of those cross-cutting things that can help make sure that we don't forget about those. So just a little comment about, hey, we need to figure out how we're going to do that. I don't think we have to answer it in this document draft, but just having that in there somewhere, in probably in like the step 1 section.
That we need a plan to deal with it. Yeah.
Yeah, we need to figure out how we're going to do that.
Okay, great. Liz?
I agree that that's where it should go, and that's a really good change. And that's also probably the place I would suggest we put, it might be like a bullet that says, coordinate the calendars and workflows regarding rulemaking and climate action office process, or something like that. In other words, I feel like a early step in our process is to just be aware of and acknowledge and probably keep like almost a calendar for the subcommittees to review of those additional steps and rulemakings that are happening to which we can be a part and need to be aware. That's how I would handle that prior conversation.
Nice.
At this point.
Yep. Great. Bram?
Just a little bit of editing, proofreading. At the top, under shorter term work, it says the legislature requested that the council, probably should say assist and not assistance.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. And I'm glad you brought us there, because I was just about to scroll up and bring us there too, because that's something where we started today talking about whether Stephanie Smith should come in to this council meeting in September or not. And it comes down to a little bit how you all want to respond to this request. We had spoken, this is just, I say we, Jared, Jane and I had spoken about one way of doing it. And then I put it on the page here as a kind of, this is one way. And I think this is important for us to talk about right now, because it impacts what you all do in this conversation in the full council in September. So let me just pause and say, this is one way to deal with that request, which is to ask the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee to sit down with state counterparts and go through those priority plans that the agency is doing. And then if that subcommittee thinks there's additional things that council should be looking at, then it can provide that additional guidance to the council. I don't know if there's other ways of dealing with it you'd like, or whether, and the role of the full council getting briefed on what's happening right now in September. I just open it up to you all to, like, how would you like to deal with this request that came in to the council? And David, go ahead. I'm happy. I thought I'd take some public comment as well in just a moment, but yeah, David, go ahead, please.
Having read the speaker's letter, being a creature of the speaker on this council, I was surprised that some of the introductory paragraphs from the adopted plan were in the letter, and that if you go further in the adopted plan, there are a number of action steps which are laid out. And it's unclear to whom that is addressed, or to what entity or organization those action steps are addressed, but they're there. And in my asking about my assignments and whatever, I've been assigned to the Resilience and Adoption Subcommittee, and that it hadn't met, and that there hasn't been much going on. There is also a vacancy at the leadership level of that subcommittee. So first off, I endorse having at least something in this work program that specifically targets resilience, not only in response to the speaker's letter, but the council has already laid out some fairly significant steps that I do not believe have been acted on. And it would be important to follow up on those. That said, I think the chairs of the council, and far be it for me to presume on your authority, need to fill that second position and need to request that the committee meet, and that the Resilience Committee itself consider this language as a start of their work towards fulfilling that resiliency responsibility for the Climate Council. It was a long way around. Get the council fully staffed, the committee fully staffed in terms of council members, get it to meet and get it to consider both a response to the speaker's letter and implementing what's already in the Climate Council plan.
Okay, thanks, David, for that. Jane and Julie?
Yeah, I was just gonna raise one of the same points David made, which is it's actually both co-chairs of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee have since left the Climate Council. It was Erica Borneman and Catherine Dimitrich. So we need two. And do think that getting those positions named may be something we want to add to the agenda for the full council meeting on the 25th.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yep.
So we can
Is
do
it
some
the-
work to solicit folks who may be interested in serving in that capacity between now and then, but it obviously will be really challenging to have a subcommittee meet or produce any work product absent having co-chairs.
Is it the full council or is it the chairs of the council who appoint?
It's actually this group right here, the steering committee, that has the sort of supervisory role of that.
Okay, I just didn't think it was the full council. That, yeah, all right. Sorry.
Yep. Jared and then Kelly. And then I do want to pause for some more public comment. Yeah, anybody has it?
Oh,
Jared?
sure. So just quickly, I think that this sounds like a good set of steps going forward. I would just specifically request that, given that the speaker's letter went to the full council, and I think that there will be councilor interest beyond just those who are serving on the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, that when this meeting gets scheduled and the announcement for it goes out and the kind of materials are shared, that we do more similar to what we've done for the steering committee meetings, which is where it's sent to the steering. Well, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that it be made really clear that the full council, as is true for all meetings, but sometimes it's a useful, like, explicit reminder, the full council is welcome to attend this meeting. Sometimes we've had these meetings where it's the subcommittee plus, but the subcommittee is really the kind of main point of focus or the driving force on it. But I think we just want to underline that, again, just especially we've had some newer members as well, just to really underline that any counselor would be welcome to join that meeting and listen in to that conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Jared. Yeah. Kelly?
The question of co-chairs raised the question in my mind of whether we are fully staffed with co-chairs on all of the subcommittees, because I think we might need more someone for ag and ecosystems, but I'm not sure. I just wanted to make sure that if we're talking about this, that all of our subcommittees have enough, they have the co-chairs and leadership.
So Jane's got a running list of that. And we currently do have co-chairs of everybody, except Rural Resilience, as far as I know, and Jane can correct me. I think there's a lot of subcommittees that have not been active, sort of waiting to figure out the plan. Like, what are we going to do now? But I think it is a question mark. Like, Jane, do you want to just say anything about the pathway for figuring out how to find new chairs on Rural Resilience and Adaptation?
Well, I'll just suggest that officially Erica Borneman, she held her position on the council as a delegate of the Commissioner of Public Service. So I was noting with Julie that we need to reach out to the Commissioner of Public Service and determine if they plan to delegate the interim VEM director. I know that the hiring of the VEM director is on hold with the flooding response. They had final candidates but haven't finished. I think it's actually, I'm not sure if it's a designee. Thanks, Jerry. There was an official designation letter that the Commissioner of Public Service gave us for Erica. So we need to figure out, first off, who's serving on behalf of the executive branch in that position. And then they would be the logical executive position for the co-chairship. So that's one act. And then the second act would be a counselor position, and that the two counselors on Rural Resilience and Adaptation right now are from the legislative branch are David and Paula. So we would have to do some outreach with the two of them. So my feeling is that there has been some interest sorry, not public service, thanks, TJ, public safety. Sorry for multiple speaking there. But that's really a process that Marion and I have discussed, because Marion sits on that subcommittee as a climate action office member. So Marion, I think, would be a logical place to do some of that outreach and can help bring forward a recommendation to the steering committee, which is really where that should probably go.
Yeah. Great. I know I've got Richard Hopkins who wants to make a comment, and Liz, I know you got a hard stop. Before I jump to Richard, just quickly, other things from the steering committee members that you absolutely want to see updated in this document before we jump in to the conversation, particularly Liz, if you got a hard stop right now, but anything else in this document? Okay. Richard Hopkins, thanks for your patience.
Good morning. I'm actually a member of the Science and Data Subcommittee. I'm here for another reason, but in thinking about resilience and adaptation, my main focus as a scientist and activist has been on the primary prevention part, on reducing releases of greenhouse gases, so that we don't have to deal with the downstream problems of climate disasters. But I do want to observe that Vermont, so I will back up a little bit. The Washington Post a couple of days ago had a big article about heat stress, and it had maps of the United States showing how many days of extreme heat stress various cities could be expected to experience in 2030 and in 2050. And Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine, most of Maine, were in the zone that had no days, 0 days of heat stress. I thought, well, that's great. We're so smart and we're so lucky that we live in Vermont. And then I thought further that what this what this map does is say, where should you move to if you want to avoid sea level rise and heat stress? And Vermont ought to be planning for something like, let's just say, a doubling in population from between the year 2030 and the year 2040, perhaps, or between 2025 and 2035. And a doubling of population means stress on schools, hospitals, water supply systems, sewer systems, highways, housing, the whole range of society will be put under stress if we have a rapid doubling in population. I'm just an advocate here that the plan ought to address this scenario, and the membership of the Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee ought to reflect that broad range of societal impacts that we can expect from a influx of climate refugees. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. Okay. Okay. So what have we done? You gave some suggestions on how to do some alterations to this work planning document. In this work planning document, I'll make those changes that we just talked about, and that'll go out to the council as a very drafty draft. And obviously the idea is to have the conversation about it. I don't know, it makes sense to have Stephanie Smith come for the meeting. I see you nodding. I see nodding heads. I think that's probably not the best timing. I think the council sort of needs to get its head wrapped around its work planning and the like. And I wonder though, Secretary Moore, if there's something to be said about how counselors could get themselves involved in the comment things that are happening the comment periods are happening right now. So if there's something else that needs to be said, just let me know. The governance document is good to go. The agenda will be changed. Send the draft to the council members. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Liz. I saw that in the chat. And the agenda will be changed with the order that we talked about, and we'll add the 30 minutes and we'll flag all those things in the email to the council. So that all sounds good. And we know that there's an imperative to work on filling the vacant co-chair positions in rural resilience and adaptation. And Jane laid out some steps to do that. Anything else before we round up?
David, I did just look on the VEM website, and comments on the state hazard mitigation plan are currently being accepted till this Friday, the 15th.
Oh, okay. Great. Well, and we will be sending an email to the council anyway, so we could just mention that, like, by the way, you know, if folks are interested. Okay. Anything else before we finish up? Okay. We don't meet again until after the council meeting. And, you know, one thing in this work planning conversation is we've talked about council meetings. Oh, yeah, Bram, go ahead.
I note that our next steering committee meeting is for what is variously called Indigenous Peoples Day or Columbus Day.
Oh, yeah.
Which
not good. I'm not sure how the state of Vermont treats that.
I had it on October 16th, but maybe the public calendar is showing it as the 9th in terms of our next steering committee meeting.
I think it needs to get moved in our calendars.
Thought we had said we were going to move it a week later to accommodate that, but maybe that just didn't get updated.
I don't think it's updated. That's a good point. We will update that unless there's any concerns about it.
Do others have that 8:30 to 10 on Monday morning, October 16th as our next meeting? Huh.
Yes. Yeah, has not been changed.
It hasn't been changed yet, but it needs to be changed. Yeah. So there's one thing, and I apologize that I'm doing this at 9:59, but Secretary Moore mentioned the transitions, and we're going to have the same situation where folks, the way this is structured is like when your term runs out on the council, you can't just keep going until your replacement is made. Just legally, it's not set up that way. And so it is possible in December that we're going to be facing a number of vacancies.
I don't think that's true with the Senate. I think they had different language than the House that actually has members continue until new names are submitted. There was something very specific in the way the House named their members with an expiration date that caused that to be the case.
Great. Okay. If someone could do a little poking around on that to confirm, yes. And it raises a question about whether waiting to December for the next meeting is the right move, but we're kind of out of time to talk about it today. But it's something that you all might want to mull over, and if you want to bring that up in the council meeting, we could talk about that a little bit. If we want to do one more meeting with the current membership of the council, particularly to finalize biomass and stuff. Okay.
I would just say very quickly that I have not looked at the language of the letter and the way that Secretary Moore is kind of comparing the House and the Senate letters, and I don't have my letter in front of me. I do know that the kind of term end date was set for October 22nd of 2024. And so those of us who are Senate appointees will be fine for the next steering committee meeting if it is on October 16th. I also wouldn't assume that we'll have vacancies. I think that it's likely that the committee on committees will move to fill seat, either reappoint or appoint new members. But that is certainly a process that needs to move forward.
Okay. All right. It's top of the hour, folks. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you at the council meeting in 2 weeks. You will see an email from Jane or myself in the next 24 to 48 hours with these materials going out to the council, so the council has plenty of time to read it before we meet on the 25th. Happy Monday, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Take care.